Welcome to Teacher in Zion Podcast. This is Doug Hatton, Teacher in Zion Podcast, and I have with me today Sarah Perry. And Sarah, you are in Missouri, in the same state I reside, not too far away, about an hour maybe. Mm-hmm. I've asked her to be on and to share her story with us, knowing that we've all had some similar, a lot of us come from different backgrounds or whatever, but we've all had some similar experiences, and I think it's very helpful for people to hear that and know. So, Sarah, just start us out, if you would, and tell us a little bit about your background,
All right. Well, I grew up in the LDS Church. My parents converted before I was born, so no pioneer heritage. I grew up in South Carolina, and just a mostly active family. My mother was abusive, so I did have struggles there. And then at church, there was also lots of bullying in my church as well, in my local ward. And I thought, it's just because we're in South Carolina and we're not in Utah where Zion is, because that's why everyone is different here and not as good as they should be. But that just kind of reinforced to me from a very early age that I needed to rely directly on God. So I definitely learned a lot of good things from the LDS Church about personal revelation, and of course the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith, and then after I got married, I kind of lived all over the country. My husband was in the military, and then during the 2020 stuff, we just felt really strongly that we needed to get out of the military, and God led us to Missouri, to specifically this house that we bought last spring. So we've been here almost a year.
All right. So yeah, I'm not a Missouri native either. So I came from Michigan. So the Lord's brought both of us here. So that's interesting. I think you said, I may have misheard, but you were talking about Utah and being Zion, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's kind of, I guess,
kind of the LDS
a cultural
perspective.
belief. Yeah, in the LDS, at least where I grew up, being not in the West, everyone just kind of talked about Utah being Zion. Maybe not as we understand Zion in the scriptures, but the place where God gathered everyone to be is over there. So I just assumed that everything would be better in Utah. And then I lived in Utah for a bit, and I discovered that was not the case. I went to BYU with my husband, and it was not at all what I was expecting. Okay.
Yeah, I heard from somebody that they thought in Utah that everyone would talk about their Mormonism or whatever, but because you're in a very Mormon state, but they said that people didn't want to talk about religion or politics, or you're afraid to offend people. Did you find that to be true? I mean, what was it like at BYU?
At BYU, I just found people, I guess to put it bluntly, just being hypocritical, just not living the gospel. Like, we would all go to church and say that we believe all these things and that we should do all these things, and then when you're not at church, people are just acting not in accordance with the gospel. It was kind of jarring to me to find, just so many rude and mean people that I found at BYU. I was very surprised, because I was going there expecting this is the paragon, this is where all of the righteous people go.
Yeah, the church is university, right? I mean, you're expecting it to be a very
I thought I would find
spiritual environment, maybe.
Yeah, like a surrogate family, community, just everything. But I had some good experiences there, but overall it was very disappointing.
Okay. Our LDS church has its small version called Graceland University.
Oh, really?
In Iowa, yeah, and it was a church campus. But a lot of people I know, as the church became, I guess, more on the liberal side and more, I guess, politically correct or whatever. But what was interesting is noticing that I think by the 60s and 70s, and especially in the 80s, it was kind of jarring for some people to find out that a lot of people that worked there, not all of them, of course, but didn't really even believe in God necessarily, or didn't believe in the church. And this has always been like the church's university, so you send your kids there thinking, well, they'll be, in a church raised environment, going to college, and yet they face some of the same things they would on any university, I guess, of unbelief or doubt,
and people making fun of you for trying to live the gospel. And it was just interesting to me how many people I found going who, after they had been at BYU a few years, had just kind of lost their faith, but they just kind of kept going through the motions of Mormonism, but even though they didn't believe a lot of it or any of it anymore. But it's interesting, all the new things I'm learning about all the different branches of Mormonism since I've moved to Missouri. I had never heard of the Hedrikites before, the Temple Lot Church. And I knew about the Community of Christ, but I did not know about the big split that happened with the Restoration branches until just recently. So I had never heard about all these different branches before, and it's just so cool to me to meet other people who believe the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith.
Neat. It is neat to do that. Yeah, I don't know how many missionaries have come by and since I lived in Michigan and in here, and a lot of them are completely surprised, never heard of anybody else that believes in the Book of Mormon who's not in the church. So it's amazing, that, I guess, you're on your own universe in a way in the LDS church, and these other churches are considerably smaller and so forth. So I'm guessing no good would come of educating people about these other splinter groups. Might raise questions, maybe. I don't know, but
and maybe that's the thing, because I thought it's just such a tragedy that we haven't been closer as churches, as church communities. We could learn so much from each other and just enjoy the fellowship of another church that believes the Book of Mormon.
Absolutely.
I'm sad that hasn't been the case.
Well, there's something really interesting happening here in Independence that I thought I would mention. So I think it's the stake president, LDS stake president here in Independence. He used to be our LDS. And anyway, he's involved in something that's called the Independence Initiative, or Alive and Well Initiative, or something like that. I'm probably doing it no justice there, but anyway, it really is an effort to clean up neighborhoods, help people out, widows and people that are needing help, going and assisting them in their home. It's a lot with the homeless people. And what it is it's an initiative that knows no denominational barriers. This is why I think it's cool. That's why I wanted to bring it up.
I love that.
So there are LDS Restoration peoples, Community of Christ people, and we're not supposed to get along, right?
Wow, yeah.
And other Christian denominations, and they also work with other Christian organizations. Like there's the Team Jesus. There's a Team Jesus in the Kansas City area, and they're going out doing things for the homeless, and they're all teaming up doing this initiative in Independence, trying to make some housing for the homeless, trying to give them meals, trying to help them out and get back on their feet. And it's kind of cool to see all these groups coming together to do something like that. It's a shame we hadn't done that sooner, because I think there'd be a lot to learn from each other. And I think maybe the hesitation all these years for us to know about each other, or to consider that maybe there's someone else out there, is precisely that. Just the idea that we've held on to being the one true church.
Yes.
Was that always kind of a really heavy thing you just were always told since growing up, like you are the one true church?
Yep. And I remember thinking, wow, I can't believe how lucky I am to be born in the only true church ever. I feel pretty differently now. I feel like the scriptures teach that there are only two churches, the Church of Christ, the Church of the devil. And I feel like there's going to be a lot more people in the Church of Christ than people would expect.
Yeah.
And Jesus is going to gather up. And in fact, the first Sunday I visited the Restoration Branch here in my tiny rural town, the sermon was about Zion, the literal gathering of Zion, which the LDS doesn't really teach anymore. Oh. And he was talking about how God is going to bring anyone he wants, and they might not be from our faith background or our tradition or our church. And he's going to gather more than just us to Zion. And I was like, yes, amen. Absolutely. I agree with this.
You know, as big as the church is, or the LDS and all that, I mean, for the most part, as far as all these people here in the United States, I think the best you could really say is that we're only one part of one tribe.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you got the RLDS and the LDS and the Hedrikites together, for the most part, we're one part of one tribe. And there's more tribes than us. So, you know, from all the four corners of the earth. And yeah, I think it's a lot like what it was in Jesus' day, isn't it? In these last days, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you know, they all thought they were the one religion. They were the only ones with priesthood, authority, all that. And then John the Baptist shows up in the wilderness. He wasn't ordained by them. So he couldn't give them any credentials to show how he was a part of their club. And they were like, by what authority are you doing this? And that was one of the things that the Lord showed me early on when I really gave my life to him and I started reading the scriptures, is he was like, this is how it's going to be in the last days. People are like, well, you don't have authority. Well, guess what? If the Lord says they do, they do. So,
God can do what he wants. That's how I feel. Yeah.
You mentioned Book of Mormon says there are only two churches. One of them is God's and one is Satan's. Well, that's pretty harsh right there. So if you're saying that you're the one true church, think about that. I mean,
yeah.
That's you're sort of saying everyone else is of the devil. We really don't have any in between ground. So that's a whole revolutionary thought right there.
Yeah, God's really opened up my eyes to the pride that, there are a lot of good things to say about the LDS Church, but I think pride is a really big problem.
Yeah.
And the one true church is one of those prideful things that we cling to. Like, we've got it all. We're just trying to give everyone what we have, because everything we have is correct.
Oh, yeah. But we were fed a steady diet of we're the one true church, the only ones with authority. And that was all great until the church started to fall apart on us. And when our leadership started to fail us, when we started to doubt that they were really listening to the Lord, well, the Lord used that to say, yeah, it's time to stop trusting in men.
Yes.
So time to start listening to me. And that seems to be what a lot of people in the LDS background are starting to experience as well, like a waking up, you know.
I feel like when the 2020 stuff happened, a lot of people felt betrayed by the leadership. Yeah. And I think that's led a lot of people to go back straight to the scriptures and see, is what we're doing even in here? I remember reading the Doctrine and Covenants as a kid in seminary and just wondering, we don't really do the church organization this way anymore. Why don't we? Because it's pretty different now. So there's a lot of things there's a lot to go through when you start questioning things. A lot of things come up, and it's a lot of study and a lot of prayer you've got to get through.
A couple of years, well, it was during 2020. I had a pair of missionaries that came in weekly for a while, and really enjoyed them and conversing with them. And I always want to give them an opportunity to share what they want to share, because it seems like once I tell them that I believe that I have the Book of Mormon and believe it, but I'm not in the church, suddenly they have all the questions. And I'd like to always turn it back around and say, is there something you want to share with me? And they shared with me a video of the current president giving an address. And I think it was a Thanksgiving address. And they played it on their phone, and it was a nice speech. They said, well, what do you think of that? I said, well, that was really a nice speech. I said, there's a lot of good things in there, a lot of wisdom. I said, I certainly don't disagree with anything there. I said, But there's one thing I noticed, and I said, I don't want to offend you. And they said, well, go ahead, say whatever you want to say. And I said, not really anything prophetic about this message. I wonder if 2020 and the response to pandemic and all that, and I don't like to get too much into the controversy of all that, and that
Yeah.
to me it's up to everyone to decide for themselves what the best response was, but was part of your disappointment in the leadership that there wasn't a revelatory experience where the Lord was leading the church in this, but it was more of a man response, just
For me, yeah, it was the instead of going to God directly, we're just going to do whatever the government says. And I just know the government does not have our best interests at heart. And to me, that's kind of like partnering up with Satan. I know everyone doesn't have as strong feelings against the government as I do, but so that was pretty bad for me. A lot of people did see some prophetic things, despite everything, because just a year or two before, we had started kind of shifting the focus to church being supportive of the family. So the family's in charge of learning the gospel at home, and they rolled out new manuals for everybody. And they were like, this is your responsibility to learn this at home, and then church is just there to support you, kind of shifting the focus. And so a lot of people saw that as, oh, well, that was clearly a prophetic change, because then we had to do home church. And I don't know, maybe. I kind of thought, maybe. I tried to think the best of them at the time. It got really hard, because I was like, we have these temples shut down, which we're supposed to be doing these saving ordinances in here for our dead, and none of them are open. We're not getting any of this important temple work done, which has been hammered into me my whole life. We got to do this. This is super important. We're just gonna, on a whim, just close it. It's no big deal. I'm like, how can we just push that aside so easily just to follow the government mandates, which weren't making sense to me? So yeah, I think that was the starting point for a lot of people. I've seen a lot of people struggle with the church since the 2020 stuff. For me, it started a little bit before then, because I had been reading. God had kind of opened up my mind to question things more, just governments and social systems in general. And then it kind of progressed to, I had this nagging feeling like I'm missing something about the church. Might not be what I think it is, might not be what I've always brought up and been taught that it is. And I found Connor Boyack, his book, Christ versus Caesar. He's LDS, and he wrote a book just really powerfully explaining how we need to make our master Christ and not the government. And he had all these historical instances of the church following the government instead of Christ, when obviously following Christ would have been going against the government, would have been a very difficult thing to do, but was the right thing to do. Like when in World War II, for Jews to emigrate away from Germany, they needed someone to write them a letter. And so Jewish members of the church and other Jewish people in Germany asked the church headquarters if they would write them some letters so that they could escape Germany, and they refused. Okay. And that was a big one for me. I was like, I did not know about this. That was just, I don't know how you could refuse to do that. I think it was just more politically expedient. Well, we don't want the Nazis to shut down our missions in Germany and shut down our churches so that we can't worship. And so that I had read about that a year or two before the 2020s. So I was already kind of starting to get comfortable with, okay, my leaders are not perfect and they make mistakes and they're human, but I feel like God can still speak through them. But then the 2020s happened, and it was harder because that was a present thing instead of something in the distant past. this was happening to me and my family. We weren't allowed to go to church because they wouldn't let you go to church at all in California for a while, which is where we were living at the time. And then they wouldn't let you sing at church, and then you could sing, but you have to wear a mask while you sing. And
so the admonition to trust the prophet, that was becoming questionable at some level.
There's a primary song called "Follow the Prophet," and I had taught it to my children because it has some good. Each verse is about a different prophet in the Old Testament, so it has some good info in there. Yeah. But the chorus is "Follow the prophet" over and over and over. You repeat it over and over and over. So I just skipped that because I was like, I don't feel good about that necessarily. I feel like it should be "Follow the Savior."
So long as that prophet is Christ, I don't have a problem.
There you go. The one true prophet.
The only one who ever did not fail us.
Right. Yeah.
So you, I know you kind of had kind of a rough growing up, but you'd been in the church your whole life, and the church experiences weren't always the safe zone either. So it seems like, I'm guessing, the Lord's been using some things in your life, throughout your life, to help you maybe put a little distance into question and be able to examine things a little more clearly.
Yeah.
And then maybe someone who had everything was rosy growing up, and it may be harder to question some things when you've gone through that. One of the things that it seems like to be a very big factor, aside from the pandemic, is the question of polygamy. It's that old ghost hanging in the background that haunted even people in the RLDS, even though we said, no, that's not of God, and neither did Joseph Smith practice or preach that or teach it ever, and yet it haunted us because
really?
Because it was the worst thing in the world to be at school and someone say, what church you go to?
Oh.
You didn't want to have to say, because we had, our church sounded just like your church. It just had the word reorganized at the end. And so immediately people would be like, oh, you guys that had polygamy? It's like, no, that was a different.
So it
haunted us just as badly. Well, I say it haunted us badly, but really nothing compared to what, I guess I'd never really considered before, that even though polygamy in the legal sense, or in a, in the physical sense, I guess, is not currently being practiced by the church. I had never considered before, I think it was until I interviewed Tricia, that if you passed away, then your husband got married to someone else in the temple,
tough one,
then you're in eternal polygamy. Even though you didn't have to suffer it in this lifetime, you're going to be in a polygamous relationship forever. I never thought about that. So that's got to be something that hung on, over you.
When I was engaged to my husband before I married him, I made him promise me that if I die first and you remarry, don't get married in the temple.
Just don't do it in the temple.
Right. And I found out a lot of women actually do have that discussion with their husband before they get married. And it's so sad that we have to.
Yeah.
That we have this hanging over our heads of, well, you're going to be dead and you won't be able to have any say. And then you'll just have to be living in polygamy when you're all in heaven together. But, so that was something I struggled with since I was a little girl. The first time I heard about it, I was like, I could just feel that it was wrong.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe that Joseph Smith had done it. And for a while, I kind of thought, well, maybe it started with Brigham Young, but then I got older and you start seeing the research from the big names like Brian Hales, and you're like, oh, well, I guess this has a lot of evidence for it. So that was really hard. It's something I've prayed about a lot over the years, and it's just been so upsetting. It was so upsetting to think about, to the point that I didn't even want to look at church history at all in case it came up. And I kind of stayed away from the Doctrine and Covenants a lot for that reason as well, because I was like, I don't want to see it in there and think about it.
Yeah.
But all the excuses, I would ask different church leaders and my mom, for different, how is this going to work in the celestial kingdom? And they're just like, oh, well, there will be no jealousy, and it's really just going to work out. And we don't know how, because we're not perfect and righteous enough now to get it, but it'll be great. And everyone who lived polygamy loved it. And just,
Yeah, right.
yeah, come to find out, that's not the case.
I think polygamy is definitely a man's idea for
Seems
obvious
like it.
reasons. And, one of the things with the notion of priesthood that we ended up with that was not there in the beginning in the Restoration by any means. But part of that notion is that, the men hear from the Lord, and then the women just are supposed to be obedient, right? That's kind of the idea. And what I found out is that the women are the other half of humanity that God made. They're the other half of God. It says he made man, male and female. And so female has half of what God is, and the male has the other half. So we're missing half if the other one doesn't have a voice. And
Right.
one of the things I've noticed is that women very much seem to be very well seated in the realm of discernment, gifts of discernment, more than men quite often.
Interesting.
And the fact that so many women have misgivings about that whole doctrine of polygamy, to me, resonates. It's telling us we're not listening. We're not listening to this wiser half, this side of wisdom that the Lord has given women. This is definitely something of men. But that must have been quite a journey for you, I guess, coming to, obviously, you felt something wasn't right about it. I assume you had to kind of research that out and pray about it, and there's a whole journey attached to that on some level.
Yeah, I dove into some historical stuff, and I couldn't find anything like there is now about like Whitney Horning's book and Michelle Stone's podcast. There's all these great resources now, but back when I was first looking into it, it just all seemed to point to, yeah, Joseph Smith did this, and yeah, it was hard. And my husband, before I started telling him how bothered I was about it, he hadn't really thought about it before. He just kind of, oh yeah, that's something that they did, and hadn't really thought about the implications of temple ceilings that still go on, and he's completely 100% on board with me now. It never occurred to him before I was like, there's something wrong here. I'm bothered by this. But I think a lot of people do stick with the LDS Church even though they are bothered by it, because it's mixed in with the truth of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith's first vision and the good things that we have of the gospel. The truth mixed with the lies makes it more acceptable and difficult to separate it out when you're brought up with, okay, if the Book of Mormon is true, then Joseph Smith was a prophet, then the prophet of today is the prophet, and everything he says is scripture. Everything all the general authorities say is scripture. They're just taught to let it build on.
It's a package deal. I mean, you either got to accept it all or throw it all out, right? I mean, that's
and it's a painful
the idea.
process to try to separate out what is true and what is tradition.
It is. Yeah.
But yeah, I was finally led to, I thought I had like settled it all in my mind because I had gotten a witness from the Spirit that I would never be required to practice polygamy. Spirit told me that. And I was kind of afraid to ask specific questions of the Lord because I was kind of afraid of what the
weren't
answers
sure
would be.
you wanted to know, weren't
Right.
sure what the answer would be.
Exactly. So I at least got that witness that it would never be required of me. And then I was okay for a while. But then I just kept having this nagging feeling like I'm still missing something. I'm still not quite aware of something. But then as I prayed for resources, God led me to this book, Mormon Enigma, Emma Hale Smith. It's a biography of her. I think it's the first one ever written about Emma, and it's by two LDS women. And they teach the standard narrative of, Joseph practiced and these were all his wives, but seeing it all in context made me go, if this is true, if Joseph really did all this, then that was wrong. And so I was trying to chew on that. And then it taught me some very important specific lessons about Emma and Brigham. Emma,
Yeah.
I discovered, just had the most impeccable character. I don't see how she could be a liar, because our church just is like, oh, well, she couldn't handle the truth, so she was just lying on her deathbed when she was still denying it all those years later and every time before then. And I was like, I don't see how this woman could be a liar. She's amazing. And then Brigham Young seemed like he was a proven, repeated liar over and over, like lying about Emma, lying about things that you can look up and see, oh, that's not true, that wasn't the case. You weren't at that meeting, Brigham, you wouldn't know,
Yeah. She was not a fan of his.
Yeah, I wouldn't
And
be either.
it does look like, as I'm reading through the histories of Nauvoo after the death of Joseph, it does appear that Emma was standing in the way, I think, to some degree, of Brigham Young being able to seize control unquestioned, to be able unquestioned to be the successor and all that. She was kind of standing in the way. He would ask her to please join with me, be a part of this, support me and all these things. I need you to turn over these papers and stuff from Joseph Smith, whatever. And she was not going along with it. So she was kind of standing in the way of that.
About him.
Yeah, she did not care for him at all. And I think, because of that and because of the witness that she bore all the way to her deathbed, I think, I don't know what the history of it is, but I guess in the LDS history and in its succession of leaders, you had to sort of either vilify or find a way to dismiss Emma Smith, didn't you?
And they did vilify her for a long time. In fact, when this book first came out, I can't remember if it was like the 60s or the 70s, the church leadership told everyone, do not read that book. Even though these were two LDS faithful women, and they were just kind of shocked that the leadership was like that, because they tell the truth about Emma, which is that she was a really good person. And that was against the church narrative at the time. So for a while it was banned. And you were not supposed to read it if you were a good Mormon. And then later they rescinded the ban, but they didn't tell anyone that they had rescinded it. So the authors wrote to them about it, and they were like, can you please rescind this ban? And they're like, oh yeah, we did. But they didn't say anything publicly about it. So, so that's an interesting part of the history. But then after that, then the narrative started to be more forgiving towards Emma. Oh, she was just traumatized and tired, and
she didn't know what she was doing. She's just
Emma.
Just a woman.
Yeah. Poor weak Emma. But yeah, then the last thing that this book taught me was about the succession crisis just not being as clear cut as the church teaches. Like, we're taught that, okay, Brigham Young was up giving a talk, and suddenly he got transfigured into Joseph Smith, and everyone saw it. And then that's how they knew that he was going to be the next prophet. And then they all followed Brigham Young. That's pretty
I've never heard that story before.
That's the gist of the story, yeah.
That probably got created in Utah somewhere, I'm guessing.
Oh, man. Yeah, my husband's been digging into the accounts for that.
Yeah.
And he found just one, and it's a later... He went back and wrote it down later, and it might suggest transfiguration. It might also... It's kind of vague.
Yeah. Well, we were always taught that it was very clear Joseph Smith set aside his son, Joseph III, as the successor, and that was the end of the story. But it's not as clear as that. Both sides, nothing was that clear. It's interesting because at different times in Joseph's life, he set aside a number of people to be his successor. David Whitmer was at one point to be his successor. And that's why a lot of people came to David afterwards, because they were present when he did it. And they said, you were named as the next successor. And, he didn't want to do that. But he never asked for that. But also, I think James Strang apparently had a letter that
which
a lot of
I've
people
read
have...
in it. Kind of, maybe you could take it that way, but you could also take it in the way of he was just being called to make a stake up there. but I don't know.
Yeah,
That
it
one's a
gets
little vague.
confusing. I mean, David Whitmer was literally made the president of the church in Missouri
Oh.
at one point. So yeah, so then there was that, and so we don't normally deal with the idea of different presidents in the church, I guess, other than like maybe a stake president or something. But I think we need to realize Joseph was human, and I don't know that he always knew exactly who was going to succeed him and how it was going to happen. I am guessing he did not expect that he would be taken early like he did. I do think he had a premonition of it, not too long before it happened. But
Yeah, he had some interesting dreams right before.
Yes, he did.
I like.
And beautiful. One of them just really beautiful to me, where it's a clear understanding that him and Hiram would be taken, and then that his other brother that would be joining them not long after that.
Samuel,
in
yeah.
that dream. Yeah. It's just a beautiful dream. I hadn't heard that until just about 2 years ago. It was the first time I'd ever read or heard that dream. And I thought, wow, what a beautiful thing the Lord was preparing him and letting him know.
Yeah.
So I understand that you wrote a letter to President Monson
yes.
about
Yes, I
polygamy.
did.
Is that true?
Yeah.
How'd that go?
I was a newlywed, so the polygamy stuff kind of came up because I got married, and I was thinking about it some more, and I was bothered by it again, and I had done my own searching through the scriptures and with my husband, and we had kind of concluded together that, okay, this is not going to be a requirement for exaltation, which is something that Brigham Young had taught. And
Yep.
there's still, in the Journal of Discourses, you can find that, you have to live this if you want to be exalted. And so we had concluded from the scriptures that that's not the case, because we were like, well, I don't think it'll be required of us if you don't need to be exalted, if you don't need to live polygamy to be exalted. So I just kind of wanted to clarify that and to get the church to clarify that. So I wrote a letter to President Monson, and I told him all of my issues with it and what my study had concluded about it not being required. And I didn't really expect to get a reply. I just asked him, can you please just, teach us about this publicly, clear up the confusion. There's so much confusion about polygamy. But a few months later, my stake president called me in for a meeting, and he had gotten a reply from President Monson for me. So he sent it to my stake president. I wasn't allowed to keep it. I wasn't even allowed to hold it. The stake president just read it to me. And
plausible deniability, I think, if you don't actually have a copy of the letter that way.
Exactly. No physical evidence. So you just have to take my word on it. And so the only thing I remember from it was that he said that I was right and that I should keep studying the scriptures. And so I was like, okay, well, good. So we don't need to live in polygamy to be exalted. So we won't have to, some people think that even if you don't, get married in the temple in polygamy here, then eventually you're going to, because that's the higher way of living for some reason. So that was an interesting step along my journey. But after I read Mormon Enigma, I was convinced that if Joseph had really done all these things, because they lay it all out in context of what was going on in Emma's life, and then in the background we have Joseph sneaking out and secretly marrying all these women. And I was just like, if he really did this, this was wrong, and I absolutely know that it is wrong now. So I was just praying, please help me find more resources to help me decide one way or another. Do I need to throw out everything? I really, really felt the Book of Mormon was true. I was like, maybe Joseph was a fallen prophet and he did all these things. I don't know what this means for us. But then I found Connor Boyack. Again, I read his book, The Christ versus Caesar. He has a podcast called Sunday Musings, and he talks about different church issues, current and historical, and he did one about Joseph and polygamy, and I expected him to talk about how Joseph was a polygamist, but he talked about how Joseph wasn't a polygamist and how history is written by the winners. And we have Brigham who wrote down all this history for us. But let's look back at what Joseph actually said. And Joseph actually preached against it consistently all the time. And we have nothing from him ever saying that he did. And no real viable proof. Everything is from so much later. And he referenced Whitney Horning's book in that podcast, which I immediately bought. And from there, I was just convinced, okay, he was not a polygamist.
I never had to be convinced that polygamy was wrong, simply by the fact that I was raised in the RLDS, not the LDS church. So we did not have Section 132 in our Doctrine and Covenants, and of course, if you're not raised and taught that like somehow this was from God, even if we don't still do it, I mean, I think the natural inclination is to know that it's wrong.
Right.
Which is an interesting thing. And no one seems to have a problem realizing it's wrong unless you're convinced that somehow you have to put that, it's part of the package deal, right? So if the Book of Mormon is true, then all the way down the line. And recently I just really felt like the Spirit was telling me to share a little bit about the idea of polygamy and some thoughts on it. And I thought, well, what am I supposed to share on this? I mean, obviously I'm biased, so, who wants to listen to me? But the Spirit kept telling me to read Section 132, and I don't want to read Section 132. Why would I want to read Section 132? I'm not going to read Section 130. This is my relationship with the Lord. He's always telling me to do something that I don't think I want to do. But one thing is, I spent my life reading the scriptures, all three standard scriptures of the RLDS, which was the Bible, Book of Mormon, and Doctrine and Covenants. And so reading the Doctrine and Covenants over and over and over and over again, because it became kind of a primary book of the RLDS church, I would say. And, it wasn't until not that long ago the Lord was like, it's time to start stepping away a little bit from that book, because it kind of overshadowed the things of the Book of Mormon. And not everything in there is correct. I discovered there were some revelations that just were not of the Lord.
I'm still trying to go through the history of
of
our LDS D&C and see where exactly everything came from.
Yeah,
Some very key verses came from William Clayton's journal, and I don't trust William Clayton anymore. So,
well, so basically the story that I was raised with is this: everything was hunky dory, and then Joseph died. And when Joseph died, Brigham Young was a bad guy. He took everyone west and did bad things. They're all wrong. We're right. And that's just get down to the simplicity of that story. But the truth is that all men are fallible, and all men make mistakes, including Joseph, and he was chastised numerous times. And this is what the scriptures tell us. God says, "I use weak things. I use the weak, and I give you weaknesses that you'll be humble. And if you'll be humble, I'll make weak things strong." It's how he does business, so we shouldn't be surprised, and we aren't supposed to put Joseph on a pedestal. I appreciate what he did in bringing forth the Book of Mormon, but however, before I came to those understandings and realized that Joseph may have made some errors, and I don't believe polygamy was one of them, but I was very familiar with the revelations that were given through him, that I knew he gave, whether they were all perfect or not. And read them over and over and again. And you get to know the cadences and the manner in which someone is speaking, even if it's the Spirit speaking through them. And you just get really familiar with how that sounds. And I'm thinking, why do I need to go read 132? And finally I thought, okay, if I'm going to do a podcast or something and speak at all about polygamy, I guess I better read this revelation. So I sat down and read it, and now I realize why the Lord wanted me to read it. Because the first thing I realized is this sounds absolutely nothing like anything that Joseph Smith ever gave. And I don't mean content. It wasn't the subject, although that was disturbing.
Yes.
It wasn't the subject. It was the words used, how words were used, the way the sentences were constructed. It was a completely different character from everything he had ever done before. At least for me. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but maybe
Yeah.
because it's inserted in your book that maybe it's not as noticeable. But when I went and finally looked at it,
Well, and I
just,
actively
wow.
avoided it for a long time
Oh.
because I didn't want to
Yeah.
have to think about that stuff. But yeah, my husband's pretty good at figuring out the, seeing the style differences. And
Yeah.
he said the same thing. Like, this is clearly in a
Yeah.
very different style than anything else, any other revelations Joseph wrote.
I don't know if it's proof positive, but surely it's an evidence. I'm surely if there was a handwriting analysis between earlier revelations that we know for a fact that, let's say, both churches can agree on did come through Joseph, and then do one on that. I
feel like
surely
someone did do an analysis of it, but I can't remember.
surely someone has.
What
But it
the
has
name
to be.
was.
It has to be completely different authorship. It's
Yeah.
got to be. There's no way you get around it. I can see it. I'm not even an expert.
Yeah. And I didn't grow up knowing the origins of 132 either, and how it just magically came out of Brigham's desk in 1852
Oh, yeah.
or something. Well, after we were already out west, like, you carried the whole desk
Yeah.
locked west. Okay.
Well, and conveniently, Joseph is dead at that point.
Yes.
Meaning he can't refute it. He can't say, yes, this was me. No, it wasn't me. Or yes, it was me, but I changed my mind, or anything. There's nothing he can do. There's nothing he can add or take away from. And so you just have to go on the word of somebody who's like, oh, by the way, I have this document that's been sitting around here for 11 years.
Yeah.
You know.
And I think it only worked because so many people knew that Joseph had translated the Book of Mormon and he was a good man and the Book of Mormon's true. Well, if if this is really from Joseph, then this
Yeah.
is something that we have to do.
Yeah, I'm not sure it could have really been an official doctrine of the church if they hadn't attached Joseph to it.
Right.
To be honest
Yeah.
with you, I think, and a lot of people did leave the church because of that doctrine. A lot of them did, if you look in the history, and even some after they got to Utah and found out that that was actually being practiced, even wasn't official yet, and it wasn't being preached publicly. As soon as people found out about it, they were going to leave. So you had to do something to lend legitimacy to that revelation for sure. So
It's just so sad to me how it's all. We started so well with the Book of Mormon being translated, and then how did it get so far off the rails that we're living whoredoms and committing adultery?
a brother of mine and a mentor, Douglas Virgil was his name. He lives up in Traverse City, Michigan, and he always for years he would read that scripture. It said that after God sows his word, that Satan comes immediately to steal away
Oh, yes.
the truth. He comes immediately to steal away the word. And I see that with the restoration, like the Lord in the Book of Mormon and the things that was coming forth. It was an exciting time. And then almost immediately Satan is in there just trying to sneak things in, trying to do whatever. And before long, we're so far off the trail that, it's like, how did we get here,
Yeah, it really shouldn't surprise us either. But it occurred to me that it would be too easy if all we had to do was join the right church and then do everything the
be a
one
member of
guy
the
at the
right
top
organization.
says, and then you're good.
Yeah. Pay your tithing and get
carry
your
you
temple
through.
recommend and get up to the pearly gate and you go, here's my temple recommend.
Yeah.
hand it to Peter and you're good. Well, let me ask you this question. Do you think this is it? Are we finally coming out of all this? Is this the last time? Is the Lord gonna gather us all together? Do you think that's where we're headed right now?
I really hope so. I really feel like my husband and I, our little family, were gathered very specifically, physically to Missouri and spiritually to where we are now, even though we're still reading and studying and pondering and praying and figuring things out and sifting through what's true and what's tradition. And but it's astounding to me to see how many people who are openly talking about how polygamy is wrong and Joseph didn't practice polygamy, because years ago when it first started really bothering me when I was a younger adult, I couldn't find anybody, and everyone I talked to about it would be like, well, it doesn't bother me, or we'll worry about that later. And I'm like, how does this not bother you? Why am I I felt like I was the only woman that it bothered in the LDS church, ever. So, but now there's just all these groups on Facebook of like-minded people. It's really inspiring to me, and I'm like,
Yeah.
something big is coming.
Yes.
Something big must be coming, because it was not like this just a few years ago. It was not.
Yeah. I'm so excited about it. To me, the proof is in the pudding. And, I saw the RLDS starting to dismantle. I saw people leaving, kind of like what's happening now in the LDS. There's just more and more people coming out. If they're not out, they're half out. And
Yeah.
they're either going to get pushed out or they will leave on their own and all that. And, I thought, wow, the RLDS church wasn't what I thought. I thought it was one true church. And it was a good church. I had a lot of good days there. But the Lord doesn't want us to come to a church. He wants us to come to Him.
Yeah.
And so we're wondering what's going on that our church fell apart on us, Lord. What's going on here? And I realized you began to teach me we're in the wilderness now, and it's like Egypt was a good place for a long time, but Egypt isn't our final destination. The promised land is. So Egypt is the church, and when he was telling me about this and I was learning about this, he said to me one day out of the clear blue, and I wasn't asking, he said, there will be a tremendous harvest out of the LDS church.
Wow.
And it was as he was teaching me about why he had brought us out of the RLDS church. And that was when I realized, oh, so you're going to do this with the LDS as well. And I decided, so that was 2012.
Okay.
Or 2007 actually was. 2007.
Okay.
So that's been a while back.
That's the year I got married.
Oh,
15 years
interesting.
ago. Yep.
Okay. And here it is happening. And it's not, and I knew immediately when he said it wasn't because he didn't like LDS or something. He loves LDS. That's why he's doing it. He loves us. That's why he did it to us. He said there'll be one shepherd and one flock. So somehow you and I and all of us who really love the Lord, we got to come together into one body, and He's got to be the head, not some other
right.
dude.
You got to strip away the layers between us and God. It's got to be direct.
Absolutely.
And then God took care of the Israelites in the wilderness. He fed them manna and gave them water from the rocks, and
absolutely.
It's really, really hard to come out of something that you grew up in and has been a part of your life, just enmeshed. It's really, really hard to let that foundation break away so that you can be built on the true foundation, the rock of Christ. It's painful, and it's a process of healing and studying and praying, but it's so worth it. It's hard, but it's worth it.
Yeah. So how did you end up gathering into Missouri? What's the story behind that? And
that is an interesting story. So my husband was in the military. He worked in a hospital, and they moved us back to California in 2020 during all the craziness, and you might have some idea how bad California was at the time.
Yes, very strict.
And we both just felt that it wasn't right, the mandates, and praying about it. I actually had a dream from God telling me not to get the vaccine, and that I needed to tell my husband that as well. And so he was ready to get it if the Lord wanted him to get it to keep his job.
Yeah.
But so we're like, well, if we want to not get the vaccine, we have to find a new job. And we've just felt we were very drawn to scriptures about Zion. So we were studying D&C about Zion, and my husband found the scripture where God says that He's named independence, and that there will be no other place given. And he just felt really, really strongly about that. And then we wanted to go to Missouri. We prayed about it, and we felt like, yeah, we should go to Missouri, even though all my husband's family is in Utah. And my dad died 6 years ago, so I don't really have family anywhere anymore. But we never lived in Missouri before, but we just felt really, really strongly called there. And had multiple dreams just indicating location and even the specific house that we ended up buying.
Okay.
I was shown that in a dream. So, and it just all worked out perfectly. It was really hard finding a job that would let him, because if he got another job in a hospital, he was just going to have to worry about vaccine mandates again. But he was able to find remote work. So he works from home and can live wherever he wants to with this wonderful job that God gave him. The company actually, he had applied before and they filled the position. And then we were kind of in the 11th hour struggling to, like, we need employment elsewhere because he's going to be kicked out of the military if he doesn't quit soon.
Yeah.
So, but they ended up calling him back in the 11th hour and they were like, we wanted to hire you so much. We just felt like we needed you on the team that we created this position for you.
Wow.
And it was a temporary position, but now he's hired on full time. And so
That's a God
amazing
thing right there.
So everything just kind of lined up perfectly.
What's interesting, you're talking about that, is I just met with another LDS couple that are listeners of the podcast that are living in the Ozarks right now.
Oh, wow.
And they came from another state completely. And John and Brenda is their name. I hope they don't mind me saying it. But they were led by the Lord to come to Missouri too, and to a very specific area. And they were shown the house, which one they should get. And, well, then somebody went and bought that house on them, and they thought, oh, I guess we don't get to get that house, you know. And it turns out about a year later, something happened. The person who had it was not able to live in it. They were doing something else, and they needed to sell it again. And they were given the first opportunity.
Wow.
And so they're now living in the house that the Lord showed them to get
That's
in the very
amazing.
location they were supposed to be in. So that's kind of neat. Kind of goes along with your experience and your husband. That's
God
pretty
is
neat.
really reaching out to people, and we just prayed so much during all that confusion and chaos to be led by the Spirit. We were like, we want the Holy Spirit to be our guide, and God answered us. He definitely led us by the hand.
Yeah, you're a living example of the parable of Zenos coming to pass. You are being grafted into the tree in the land of Zion. And as he
yes.
brings more and more people like you in, he'll start grafting out some of the people that don't belong here. That's how that
Moving
works.
things both ways.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
true.
That's right. So, well, that's cool. And so how long have you been here?
We moved here last April, so almost a year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
April. Okay. So, and you visited a restoration branch recently. Do you mind
Yes.
saying something?
That was another
yeah.
interesting miracle because I had joined a local Bible study group just with some neighborhood moms, and we were studying the book of John. And I remembered, I took, in BYU, I took a New Testament class for one of my religion credits. You have to have a certain number of religion credits. So I looked up my old notes from there, and I found some notes that I'd written down from the professor about how the Bible that we use, the LDS use, only has about 600 of the JST changes, the Joseph Smith translation, in the footnotes and the appendix. But there are actually over 3,400 something changes. And so I was like, well, I forgot about that. And now I really want a Joseph Smith translation Bible that I can just study, where it's all in the text and I don't have to flip to the back or look at the bottom, and it's all there, not just 600 handpicked by a committee changes. And I was praying because I was like, I have no idea if this even exists or where I can find one. And then we just happened to find the restoration branch in our tiny little town. We live very rural and we were just kind of shocked that there was one here of all places. And so we went to visit, and they gave me an inspired version of the Bible the day we visited. And I was like, this is the Bible I was praying for. It's amazing.
I hate to tell you, but it went through a committee too. So
okay, that's what I thought, but I didn't think it had as many changes.
well, so there's a book, church historian, Richard Howard, which is an interesting book. And not everybody's excited about this guy because
the name sounds familiar.
he no longer really believes in the church or anything like that, but he was a church historian. But he was a good historian. He was
he's
very
the one
interested.
who said that Joseph was a polygamist, right?
I think recently or something he came out saying that he probably was or something,
Okay.
but that's an opinion.
Yeah. Yeah.
This work he did, I think, in the 60s originally, or early 70s or something. And what it was a book where he was interested in how did we get our restoration scriptures that we have, meaning the three standard books of our LDS, right? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because, there's some changes in there that we don't even know where it came from. Some things were extracted from a personal Bible of Joseph Smith, where he was just writing things in the column.
In the margin?
Yeah, and it wasn't necessarily he was saying this is an authorized change of the Bible. It's just where he's writing things, and there are some parts that I can't really track down, but there's also some good things in there that I do appreciate for sure. And
it has way more of the original manuscript than my LDS Bible
I think
does.
like in Genesis is a lot of stuff in Genesis, and I think most of that was what was called the Book of Moses. I think.
LDS, the Pearl of Great Price, Book of Moses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
is
Book of Moses.
Just kind of grafted into Genesis, which is super interesting.
Jammed in there, so suddenly all the chapters and verses are way off from everyone else's Bibles. I understand that LDS had, I think, a version where it's a King James. And then it's sort of like a study Bible where below there would be notations of what Joseph Smith had. Is that how that was?
And they're not all there. There's only 600 of them.
Yeah.
And some of them are in the footnotes, and then the longer ones, the longer approved ones are in an appendix behind the Bible. So it'll have the little reference at the bottom that you can go look up and then read it. But I was like, I want it all together for studying purposes. Because we've got an enormous, I don't have it with me, hardcover of the original manuscript, and it's got all the changed parts, but it's not in context with the rest of the scriptures, so it's not great for studying, but it's good for reference.
Okay, yeah, okay. So, first thing when I hear you say that you visited a restoration branch, the first instinct in me is to apologize to you immediately. But you had a good experience. You said they're not all bad. There's some good ones out there. So
it was just so great meeting more people who love the Book of Mormon and preach the Book of Mormon over the pulpit, and
a larger family.
The spirit is great there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They've been so welcoming and sweet, and it's great meeting more people who live in our because our town is tiny, so good to meet more local people in any case. And
do they seem familiar to you, even though they're not LDS? Do they seem familiar to LDS, or is it do they feel like a different kind of people for some reason?
The service is very different.
Yeah.
Some of the people do remind me of, like, the kind of feeling I get from, like, you can look at someone and kind of tell if they're Mormon or not, or I can anyway.
Yeah.
I met a few people today who were like that. I was like, if I didn't know you were not Mormon, I would guess you were Mormon.
Well, I meet people all the time. I think they must be RLDS. I've been around RLDS so long. There's like a feel to them. I can't explain it.
No, I have
and
the
it
same
doesn't matter
thing
where
with
I
LDS.
go. I go, oh, these are RLDS people. They have a certain. I'm not saying the spirit to them, but like there is a certain thing about
Aura,
it. And
something.
And I meet a lot of Mormons, or people that I think are Mormons all the time. I think they must be Mormon. Like there's a feel to them. There's like something about them. They are a peculiar
something
people.
in the demeanor. Yeah.
Something in the demeanor, behavior, whatever it is. Maybe they're not drinking coffee. I don't know what it is. One way or another. But so you
the
got
sermon,
something out of that.
The first sermon, the first Sunday we went, the sermon was about the literal gathering of Zion in Missouri. And that just kind of blew me away because I kind of felt like we had been gathered there for that purpose.
Yeah.
And that's not something that the LDS Church really teaches anymore. Zion is in your heart. Zion is wherever you are. You have to make Zion in your community, which I definitely think is a good goal.
Sure.
But there's also going to be a literal place which God set aside for Zion. And
that was a big
I
thing.
Hearing that over the pulpit.
That was a big thing in the RLDS for quite a while. When I was growing up, is Zion is in your heart,
Oh, okay.
And I think that was I think that was a shift because I think what it is when we're no longer in God's plan, where he's planning to gather all the tribes and then we have this work to do and we're going to bring about Zion and or the New Jerusalem, as the Book of Mormon puts it. When you're focused instead on the church as being the ultimate goal,
Yeah.
then I guess Zion needs to be in your heart, right? And I'm not against that idea. I love the idea that Zion is in your heart. And then we even have a scripture that says, Zion is no further or closer than the spiritual condition of my people. You know, so there's truth there. But
Yeah.
but also I think probably from what I've seen, the LDS Church turned the church into Zion.
Yes.
If you're in the church, you're in Zion, right?
Right.
Wherever
You're
you
being
are.
gathered into Zion, and then your stake is your little Zion island, wherever you
Yeah.
are in the world.
But surprise, surprise, even in the Bible itself, the prophets are continually talking about God is going to fulfill his covenants with his people, including those lost tribes that nobody knows where they went. But the prophets know. The prophets said, oh, they've been distributed to the four quarters of the earth, even to the isles of the sea. They're everywhere. And he's going to gather them into one place. And so you're like, okay, we can say Zion is wherever it's in your heart, but guess what? There's going to be an actual literal New Jerusalem built. There's going to be an actual physical gathering, and now you're doing it, and
Yeah.
I've done it, and lots of others are doing it.
And I remember reading about that as a kid and just wondering, like, why aren't we all moving to Missouri? What's...
You're on Plan B.
Yeah. So that confused me quite a bit as a kid, like just looking at how different things were in the scriptures versus how things were in the tradition, in the culture. It just was a big struggle for me, and I always struggled in the church culture in general too. So many people are like, oh, I love the LDS church culture. It's a great community. And I just never had that.
Yeah.
But God was teaching me to rely on him, I think.
Yeah. He definitely had his hand on you, I think, all your life probably, and trying to bring you to where he wants you to be. And, you know, and I noticed that you also did put some stock, and I think you said your husband did, in that revelation that Joseph Smith that said that Zion would not be removed from her place.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not just going to up and move over to Utah or Nauvoo or wherever.
Continuing revelation. The new prophet says this, so it's different now. Yeah.
yeah, ever evolving, you know. But I was always raised that God is unchangeable. You know, he's the same yesterday and today, and you know, and the thing is, God already knows everything is going to happen. So, whenever we get in this position where we have to explain things as if God didn't know something was going to happen, so he had to change his mind, and now move Zion somewhere else or whatever, like it's hard for me to buy into that because that's not how God.
Contingency plan.
Yeah, this sounds like men trying to, you know, make things work the way they
Explain the difficult history
Yeah.
in, I guess, a faith-building way, but let's just be honest. I think the truth will set us free.
Yeah. Well, I just want to sort of open it up to you, I guess. I know we're about an hour and 13 minutes, but I wanted to sort of open this up as far as something on your heart, something the Lord's been talking to you recently. What's exciting for you and your husband right now? What's on the horizon spiritually? And
I have a list of questions. I have 3 young kids that I homeschool, so it's hard to set aside time to go study and pray, but I try to add to my list of, when I have time, I'm going to pray about this next. I'm going to try to research into this next. And, we both just diving into more and more history and just trying to sort out, I guess, the wheat from the tares in the history.
yes.
And it's just been amazing seeing the changes just in people all over, and not just in us. To see God's hand moving in so many different ways, it's so exciting. And we're happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, very, very, it is a blessing indeed, just to know that he is moving, and know that, you know, we're part of what he's doing. We get to be a part of it. And I know more and more people we haven't even met yet, we've never talked to, and are in the forums that you and I are in that we've never even talked to, and yet they're on the same path.
Yeah.
And what's also amazing, too, is not even just Book of Mormon believers. I mean, my wife and I I had to get her out of the house, so we could have alone time for a moment. And I said, can I take you on a date? We went out to the steakhouse and we were eating. And there was a big table of people just behind us and over to the side. And they were all talking about the Lord. What the Lord is doing and what's happening and all the exciting things God is getting ready to do and all this. And we were appreciating it. And we were talking about the Lord ourselves, but we kept overhearing them talking about the Lord. And my wife got up and she just, when they got ready to leave, and she says, I just want to tell you that I just love that you guys were talking about the Lord over here. And I can't wait for the day where everyone in this whole restaurant would be talking about the Lord. And they were excited. They hugged her, and then they gave us they wrote down their information and stuff. And they're part of a Christian equipping ministry here in Independence or Kansas City area. And it's interesting because this entire equipping ministry and all these people are doing all these things for the Lord. It all started because one of them had this vision. And the vision was that they saw that Kansas City area was this like central place where God was going to do this amazing work. And in the vision, they saw that it was like the hub of a wheel, this area. And this is now the third time I've heard of this vision. And this is from complete strangers that I've heard it. So this is a third witness of this vision over the years of Independence being the hub. In fact, their ministry was Convergence something, equipping hub or something. And they called it hub because of the vision. And so Independence is this hub. And then there's these lines going out like spokes of a wheel, north, east, south, in every direction. And people are coming in from every direction and coming to this convergence.
That's amazing.
And so they've got a vision of Zion. And I don't think I've ever shared this on the podcast either, but there was another place that we were led to go to called Shift KC. It's not even a church. It's an equipping ministry, trying to equip people to walk in the gifts and to begin to do their own ministry. And that happened because of their pastor. His name is Caesar. He lived in Texas. And he was going to the ministry and had a passion for the Lord. And the Lord said, I need you to go to Kansas City area. And he's like, well, I don't want to go to Kansas City. And the Lord said, if you don't go to the Kansas City area, you won't have a ministry. And so he came here. And the first night I ever walked into that church, he gave a vision of what he saw was going to happen in the Kansas City area, is how he put it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And what it was a 20-minute vision that it was exciting. It was a picture of Zion.
Wow.
He saw a highway between heaven and earth, and the angels were descending and ascending, and that there was just the whole world was, and the whole world was looking to this area. And I'm just thinking, this guy's not even a Book of Mormon believer. He doesn't even believe in Joseph Smith's visions or anything like that. And yet it's the same God. And he loves these people. They don't have to believe exactly how we believe. Somehow he's going to put us all into one. And that's exciting. It even goes beyond LDS, RLDS, Temple Lab, whatever. And that's astonishing to me. Like, how does he pull this off? I have no idea, but I'm glad we don't have to make it work. He's gonna make it work. So.
Yeah, during that sermon at the Restoration Branch where he was talking about the literal gathering of Zion, he mentioned someone who wasn't even a member, never heard of any of this before. He had a dream that Zion, I think he said Zion was going to be in Independence. And so, like, he lived in Illinois or something. So he moved down here because of that dream, and he was not affiliated with any branch of Mormonism at all. So, the point of the sermon was saying, it's God's going to gather whoever and everyone and anyone who will hear his voice and follow him.
You can drive around Independence and go, this doesn't look like Zion.
That was kind of sad when we discovered, Independence actually has kind of a bad reputation for being kind of a druggy area and rundown. And
But, there's that scripture that says we'll have to build up the waste places of Zion. So when
Right.
you're driving around Independence, you go, oh, yeah, see, we got to build some stuff up here. We're going to have to
Yes.
knock down a few things, too. I don't know.
So all of this ultimately led to me leaving the LDS church, and not everybody feels like they need to do that.
Yeah.
And I totally agree. Like, do what God tells you to do specifically.
Amen.
But I kind of had a really bad experience with my local leaders, just with ecclesiastical abuse and just kind of throwing the handbook at me very unmercifully. And God had kind of forewarned me about that happening in some dreams that I'd had. And so when it happened, I was like, okay, God knew this was coming.
Yeah.
He was trying to prepare me for it coming, and it was very heartbreaking, awful experience to go through. But then I kind of just came to the conclusion, okay, I think God is like showing me that he's in my corner, and he knows that this was wrong, and that it's okay if I leave. And I really, really struggled with that. And, I've been a member my whole life. My dad baptized me, and it's a big, big change. But after I finally did, I was very prayerful, and I waited and I thought about it. But after I finally did send my letter, I got so much peace from the Spirit. Just an outpouring of the Spirit and light filling me up. And so
he was setting you free, but it's a hard thing to go through. It has to be, even though not all of your experiences in the LDS Church were great. I mean, it wasn't the panacea, I guess. That some people may think it was. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's got to be hard. It's still part of you were born and raised in that church.
Yeah, and devoted to the gospel. Just loved the gospel and had good experiences with God my whole life. And so it took a lot of faith for me to trust God that this is really what you want me to do, and you'll still be there for me when I take this leap. And he has been. So I think if that's something that the Spirit is nagging you to do, it was very slow for me for a while. I would just have this quick little quiet thought of, what if I just let go and stopped trying to make it work?
Yeah.
And I would just feel peace, but then I would immediately get scared, and I would chase the peace away with my fear. But then after I went through with it and did it, I've had nothing but peace and an outpouring of the Spirit. It's been just amazing.
How you know you're on the right track right there. And
yeah.
I know for every person it's different, because the Lord has a different plan for everyone. So for some people, he may be asking to stay, and in some ways staying may be I think it may be a harder path down the road than it will be. And some of them will have to leave at some point, or they may be forced out. But some of us, he calls out, and here's a wonderful thing. It's sort of like, well, either I've been forced out of the church like some people have, or I've chosen to leave, or maybe it's a mix. But the funny thing is when we find out, lo and behold, we're not out of the church. We're actually still in the church.
Right.
There's only one church. And guess what? It doesn't know any denominational barriers. It is all those who qualify according to his word in the Bible. In the Book of Mormon, it's really clear that it's not about whatever institution you belong to. So thank God for that, And then and then sometimes you lose one family and you find out, but there's another family you have,
Yeah.
So I count you as family. You can be a sister. I could use another sister, and
I need all the family I can get.
your husband can be a brother, and there's a lot of good people in this area. A lot of people are gathering here, and those people are being brought here. They're good people, even the ones that don't believe in the Book of Mormon. Good
That's
people.
So true. Yes.
I say don't believe in the Book of Mormon yet.
Right.
But the day is coming. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is we believe in Christ.
Yes.
It may probably become apparent at some point after what the things that the Lord does, especially with the seed of Lehi. It'll become, I think, apparent that it is true, but it wasn't the point. I mean, the whole point of the Book of Mormon was to lead us to Christ, right? Not vice versa.
Set us straight on some things, and
Yep,
to
definitely.
help us find Christ.
Yeah,
Amen.
100%. Yeah. Well, is there anything else I know we're getting kind of late. I don't know if you're going to have to go, but I mean, is there, just speaking to you off record possibly here, but is there anything else you really wanted to talk about? I know there's a lot of things we didn't talk about today.
I think we covered the biggest things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, also you can always come back,
That's true if you want me.
So if if
I
there's some
loved
things
watching the interview with Trisha that you did, because I related to a lot to that, even though she was like, oh, the community. And I was like, oh, I never had that, but I always really wanted it. I wanted it to work so badly. I was like, I want this to feel like the true church that they say it is.
Yeah.
But
Well, maybe you didn't get that experience because that would have been a hindrance to you.
I think so.
In coming to what you need to come to, and who knows? We all have different paths to walk, and
I definitely feel like God calls some people to stay, like you said, so for different purposes.
Absolutely, we all have our own path to walk, and but we'll all end up in the same place eventually, however we get there. So, as long as we're following the Spirit, I really do appreciate everything you've shared today. And I know your walk doesn't stop today, so you're still continuing with the Lord and you're learning things. If you decide you want to come back at some future point and you want some things to share with people or some new understandings and whatever else, that you're always welcome back.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you so much.